Hi everyone, my name is Kate Lynch. I'm here to discuss with you cystic fibrosis, a little bit about what it is, what causes it, how it's inherited, and some genetic tests that are available. So, what is cystic fibrosis? Well, it is characterized by genetics home reference as a buildup of a thick and sticky mucus that can damage many of the body's organs. So, why does this buildup occur? So, the disorder is caused by a mutation in what is called the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. So, I know that's a big mouthful, so for now we're going to call it the CFTR gene. We'll go over some details of the CFTR gene a little bit later, but for right now, all we really need to know is that if there's a mutation in the CFTR gene, the mucus that is naturally produced by the body becomes very thick and sticky, and it coats vital organs of the body, including the lungs and the pancreas. So as a result of this thick and sticky mucus, the airways and ducts of the body are clogged. And because this is a recurrent pattern, the disease often results in permanent lung damage, and it also includes formation of scar tissue, which is called fibrosis, and cysts in the lungs as well, hence the name cystic fibrosis. So the sticky and thick mucus buildup also can affect the pancreas because it is also a mucus-producing organ of the body. The pancreas produces insulin as well as digestive enzymes, and when mucus builds up around the organ, its functions are impaired, and this can lead to digestion problems that include malnutrition, poor growth, and some weight loss. It can also cause the insulin production to be impaired, and this can lead to cystic fibrosis-related diabetes. Okay. So now that we know a little bit about what cystic fibrosis is, let's talk about the specifics of the CFTR gene. We know the disorder is caused by a mutation of the gene, but what really happens? So when the gene's purpose is to move negatively charged chloride ions in and out of the cell. And it's important to know that chloride is an important makeup of sodium chloride, and this is also known as salt. So it's also really important to know that on the cellular level, water also always follows salt to maintain an equilibrium of the cells that are in our body. So in turn, salt really controls where water goes. So if salt goes towards the skin, water will go towards the skin. Same with muscles, organs. So water contributes to the mucus in our bodies because it kind of waters it down, makes it thinner, more free-flowing. So when there's a mutation in the CFTR gene, the chloride channels that the gene is responsible for are inhibited, and the salt or the chloride doesn't move to where it's supposed to go. And this means that water also will not follow. So when the water doesn't follow, the mucus that's produced becomes sticky and thick, and then it coats the important organs like the lungs and the pancreas, as I mentioned before. And it's just not watered down, and it leads to clogging of airways and ducts, causing the symptoms of the disease. So over here on the side of the slide, I have a picture of a normal CFTR gene. So the individual has inherited a chromosome from mom and a chromosome from dad. And these code for a nice healthy CFTR gene, which codes for a nice healthy CFTR chloride channel. So we see that in number 2. In number 3, we can see that the chloride transport goes into this channel and outside of the cell. So the chloride is now outside of the cell, water comes to it, and it waters down the mucus around it, and it's nice and free-flowing. Air can pass through, and everything is all good. So if both parents end up passing down a mutated gene, or the recessive allele, which we will discuss later, the individual will become afflicted with a mutation of the CFTR gene. And this means that the CFTR chloride channel won't work the way it's supposed to. So either chloride won't come through, or it'll come through just a little bit impaired. Either way, water isn't as present as it should be, and mucus is no longer free-flowing, and it's sticky, and air gets caught, and then the person afflicted with cystic fibrosis will start presenting symptoms. Okay, so the way it's inherited. So cystic fibrosis is inherited via the recessive trait from the parents. And in order to express the disorder, the individual must be what's called homozygous recessive. So they must receive a cystic fibrosis gene from mom and a cystic fibrosis gene from dad. So over here in this picture on the side, we'll say that the yellow represents recessive and the gray represents dominant. So these two parents meet and they produce offspring. Both parents are considered carriers and neither present cystic fibrosis symptoms, nor do they have it. So they have their first child, and the first child gets both gray alleles, or both gray genes. So this child will not be afflicted with the disorder because it doesn't even have the gene that codes for it. Then they have another child, and they will get the yellow and the gray, which means they have a recessive and a dominant gene, and they will be considered a carrier. They will not be afflicted with the disorder, but they will be carrying it, as will the third child. And then the last child will inherit the yellow from mom and the yellow from dad. And this makes them the homozygous recessive, and they will be afflicted with the disorder. So here is what I call a pedigree. Can't see it all the way. I'm going to move myself. So this will show the inheritance pattern throughout generations. So the first generation, or we'll say great-grandparents, Brad and Liz, and they both have the genotypes A, big A, little a, which means they are heterozygous or they are a lot like the parents in the previous slide. So they are both carriers, but they do not have the disorder. So we can see through what's called a Punnett square over here in the top left. We have big A, big and little a, and then big A, little a. And then all of the genotypes express a dominant allele except for one, this is the exact pattern that we saw on the previous slide. And they will, if they have 4 kids or whatever, there's a 25% chance that one of the kids will have cystic fibrosis. So Brad and Liz end up having 3 children, and they have, this is really small for me, sorry, Olivia, Brian, and Chris. So we'll start with Chris. Chris has big A and a big A. So he is homozygous dominant, which means he doesn't even have the trait at all. So he is not a carrier, he is not afflicted with the disorder, and he is healthy. And he marries Kelsey, who is heterozygous, which means she has the dominant and the recessive. Neither of them have the disorder. One is a carrier, but because only one is a carrier, there is 0% chance that any of their offspring will have cystic fibrosis. However, Kelsey will pass on her recessive allele, that little a, to her children. So we can see they have John, Grace, and Allie. And Allie is heterozygous, big A, little a. Grace is homozygous, dominant, big A, big A. She is not a carrier for cystic fibrosis. And John has big A and a little a. And then John marries Holly, and they have 1 child, and they also share the 25% chance of having an offspring with cystic fibrosis. So we go back up to that top left Punnett square. And unfortunately, they have a child that is homozygous recessive and has cystic fibrosis. So in the middle, we have child number 2, Brian, who marries Kelly. And they are both heterozygous, big A, little a. And they also share the same percentage as Brad and Liz. So 25% chance that their child will have cystic fibrosis. They have 1 child that is heterozygous, big A, little a, which is, we can see from the top Punnett square again, that it's one of the 75% chance that they will not have a child with cystic fibrosis. And then they also have Lily, who ends up being homozygous recessive and ends up having cystic fibrosis because she inherited both of the recessive alleles from Brian and Kelly. And then we go to child number 3 of Brad and Liz, and this is Olivia. Olivia is unfortunately one of the 25% that ended up inheriting the cystic fibrosis from Brad and Liz, and she is homozygous recessive. And Olivia marries Mike and has 3 children. And because she is homozygous recessive, he is heterozygous, and he has a dominant big A and a recessive little a. We can look at the middle Punnett square, which is on the right of all of them. And we can see that there is a 50-50 chance that their child will inherit cystic fibrosis. So they have 3 children. Lizzie, she ends up receiving the dominant allele as well as a recessive, so she is heterozygous. And then they have Daniel, who ends up being one of the 50-50 that has cystic fibrosis. He inherited the little a and little a, so he is homozygous recessive, meaning he will have the disorder. And Alana, how to zoom in, also will not have the disorder, and she will be heterozygous. Okay, so now we'll discuss some genetic testing that is available that can help with early diagnosis and treatment of cystic fibrosis. So I like to think of it as kind of steps in the process of genetic testing. So the first step in genetic testing for cystic fibrosis is testing for the parents to see if they are carriers of the disorder. And this is called preconception carrier screening. So if a test is found positive, which means both parents end up being carriers, the couple will then be offered antenatal genetic testing. Sorry. So this means antenatal genetic testing are procedures performed during pregnancy that can detect health problems within the growing fetus. So they'll be able to have an early diagnosis of cystic fibrosis, and the parents will become aware if the child will have the disorder or not. And then the final genetic test is neonatal screening, and this uses an initial biochemical test, and it looks for immunoreactive trypsin, in plasma, and then it's followed by genetic testing in infants with raised immunoreactive trypsin. So after this test, if this mutation is found, because it's also associated with cystic fibrosis, they will use a definitive diagnosis test. So this is after the neonatal screening. Then they see that they have the raised levels of the IRT, the immunoreactive trypsin, and they'll use probably a sweat test that will measure the raised levels of chloride. Hence the chloride in the previous slides explaining why the CFTR gene mutation causes the disorder. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about cystic fibrosis and what causes it and how it's passed down through generations and some genetic testing, we can see that it can affect everybody a little bit differently depending on the severity, just like with any other disorder. And we can see that genetic testing is available, and we can see if there is a possibility for early diagnosis and treatment of the disorder. And here are some references for my information, and I also have references for the pictures. All right.